Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Medieval Work in Progress seminar. My name is Tom Nixon. I teach medieval art and architecture here at Courtauld, and in a moment I'm going to introduce our speaker. But before I do that, I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of upcoming events. One is this lecture, also in this series, which will take place on the 25th of March, with Giuseppe Fabiano, who's one of our former PhD students. In fact, do take a note of that. You can book that through the Courtauld website, as you probably did for this. And then another event on the 1st of April, so shortly after that, Living by the Rule. This is an event in relation to an exhibition that my colleague Jessica Barker is organising in Norwich later this summer. So that may be of interest to you as well. And again, you can find all the details on the website. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anya Breughel, who is an affiliated lecturer and Barry Fellow in History of Art at Lucy Cavendish College in Cambridge. Anya completed her PhD in Cambridge with Paul Binsky in 2019 and has published a number of articles based on that PhD research, which really looks at ideas of kind of craft in medieval art making and thinking. And in fact, that research will be the subject of a new book, Medieval Poesis, the Mechanical Arts and Philosophical Literature, circa 1100 to 1250, which hopefully will be out with Oxford University Press next year. Tonight's talk comes out of a quite long-standing interest, I think, in views from above and various things, and this is also closely related to an article that she has forthcoming in a volume edited by Carl Knappett and Matt Cavler on the miniature Unreal Presence, and that's due out later this year?
In April, yeah.
In April, very soon. So you can see all the footnotes for this when it comes out, if you like. She's also had, got 2 young kids. I like to think a baby is about a book in terms of workload, so she's been busy in the last few years. As usual, we will have a paper. It'll be about kind of 45, 50 minutes. Time for questions after that, and then I hope you'll be able to join us down the hall for some drinks and more informal discussion afterwards. But for now, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, just to thank Tom very much for the invitation, and thank you everyone for coming. It's a real honour to have been invited to come and speak in this wonderful series. I want to start today with a series of medieval creations, visual, verbal and sculptural, all of which will almost certainly not be new to my fellow medievalists, although the combination might be. So first, England's oldest altarpiece, made for the high altar of Westminster in the 1260s, known as the Westminster Retable. And specifically, though we'll come back to its complete iconography later, as you can see there. Specifically, the tiny globe at its centre, at the very heart of the retable, cradled in the hand of Christ and about the size of a 10-pence piece, is the world itself. The orb is filled with sun, moon, stars and clouds, which arc over plants and trees, growing on a sandy bank on which a bird pecks, and a sheep grazes. And in the foreground, perhaps you can see, a little boat bobs past with a minute rower and a companion, in that little boat. Now, as we'll see, this orb of around 1260 has a number of analogues in European manuscript illumination and wall painting from the next century or so, from the mid-13th to mid-14th centuries. Second, perhaps even more familiar, the English anchoress Julian of Norwich's Middle English text, The Revelations of Divine Love, which dates to sometime after 1373, and specifically her famous vision within this, and please forgive this really naff mock-up, but I actually just thought it was the most helpful visual cue that I could find on Google Images to go with the text. Her vision within this text of a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand, which Julian understands to be creation itself. She says, "I looked thereupon and thought, what may this be? And I was answered generally thus, it is all that is made." And just as the painted miniature orb of the reed table has analogues in art, Julian's vision has analogues in other contemplative literature, particularly works like the Cloud of Unknowing of the second half of the 14th century. And the final artefact, or kind of artefact, that speaks to these, the prayer nut. The prayer nut was, as many of you will know, a type of tactile devotional aid that developed in the Netherlands in the 15th century. Designed to hang from belts or on rosaries, these spherical boxwood objects open to reveal minutely carved scenes from biblical history. And here's one now in the British Museum's Waddesdon bequest, made between 1510 and 1525, which encloses in the space of just 13 centimetres, but we'll look at one later that's just 4 centimetres wide. This one is 13 centimetres. It encloses scenes from the Old Testament, the life of the Virgin, and Christ's nativity to crucifixion. Prayer nuts don't show the world as such, but in their crowded and encyclopedic diminutive carvings, they seem intended to be taken as little wholes, little standalone worlds, as many people have pointed out before. While all these works are from different specific cultural milieu and diverse in kind and media, of course, they indicate, I suggest, a distinctive late medieval, Northern European preoccupation with radically downscaling the whole of creation. And this preoccupation is the subject of my talk today. And this talk represents a section of a larger book project I'm working on as well, on medieval ideas of looking at the world from above. And as Tom said, a lot of this research is in a forthcoming article, hoping to be worked up as a section of a book. Of course, people had imagined, they depicted and described transcending the world and seeing it from a great distance, long before the Middle Ages, and long before these things were made or written. A detached view of the world was described in numerous ancient texts, particularly the works of the Stoics, who prized it as a helpful image for setting your worldly concerns literally in perspective. And this image is so prevalent that classicists have given it a name, literally, which is kataskopos, which means literally view downward. A stereotypical example, to give you a sense of how ancient writers imagine such a view and to what end, is Cicero's text, The Dream of Scipio, or in Latin, the Somnium Scipionis, from the 2nd century BC, which was available in manuscripts throughout the Middle Ages and was a very important model for medieval writers. Cicero, in a sort of fictional appendix to his text called De Re Publica, he imagines the dream vision of the exemplary Roman general, Scipio, where Scipio is visited by his grandfather, who lifts him to a heavenly perch from which he sees the starry spheres were much larger than the earth. Indeed, the earth itself seemed to me so small that I was scornful of our empire, which covers only a single point, as it were, on its surface. And his grandfather says to him, "If you will only look on high and contemplate this eternal home and resting place, you will no longer attend to the gossip of the vulgar herd or put your trust in human rewards for your exploits." And as I go on, I'll have the Latin as well for some of these quotations. Obviously, this is originally in Latin. You probably all know Carl Sagan's famous photo of the pale blue dot, which is Earth there in that beam of light, taken from 6 billion kilometres away in 1994. What one discovers in works like Cicero's is that this sort of perspective, which we think of as a very recent one, of course, was imagined in ancient texts long before it was realised by technology. And actually Sagan in his book quotes from people like Cicero and Marcus Aurelius as inspiration and models for the photo in the first place. It's worth stating also that it wasn't just in the classics that medieval Christians found views from above. There were also such visions in the Bible, so much of which is infused with Greek and Roman philosophy anyway. We're in the season of Lent, the season of resisting temptations, and one example, for anyone who knows their Bible, is how Satan tempts Christ with a view from above in the Gospels, which I mentioned so that I can show you these wonderful medieval depictions of that temptation. So on the left is an image from a manuscript from the 12th century, and on the right is the a panel that was from a ceiling decoration. So the examples that I began by showing you have already been related in passing to the sort of view that's found in Cicero, the classical kataskopos, view from above. So Fritz Scholten is a curator of prayer nuts. He's made this point about prayer nuts. And Marcia Kupfer, who's a wonderful medievalist of maps, has talked about the kataskopos and the view from above as context for looking at the Westminster orb. But what my paper aims to do today is explore in greater depth how exactly these images, these objects and visions relate to that long tradition of aspiring to a transcendent view of Earth. I want to argue, in fact, they form a kind of tradition of their own, a peculiarly late medieval response to the idea of a transcendent view. Because, of course, to see the world from above means to see it small, as Cicero sees it. But what we notice looking at these is they're not just small worlds, distantly hanging in space. In each case, the object draws attention to its own scale. There is the orb literally held in Christ's hand. The prayer nut is for handling. Even if the term nut seems to have been applied later, there is evidence that these were sometimes called apples in texts. So again, an emphatically everyday little thing contains the world. And there in Julian's hand is a hazelnut representing all that's made. The hazelnut was itself a unit of cooking in the Middle Ages, so its scale again had this particularly mundane, domestic quality to it. And that's the difference between these being small worlds and miniature worlds. They show the created world as if from a distance, but also as unfolding from the emphatically minute, from something that's in the world and part of the world, apple, hazelnut, orb. You may have already thought of William Blake's much later famous image, which they also evoke, of the world in a grain of sand in his Auguries of Innocence, which is itself probably a spin on the biblical book of Wisdom, where the whole world is said to look to God as the least grain of the balance and as a drop of the morning dew. So these are some nice other kind of miniaturizing images from earlier and later. So building on the suggestions of others, I want to show these objects are, yes, continuous with the long tradition of kataskopos, the ambition to a view from above, but also to consider what their miniaturization adds and what it might mean. I suggest for the first time they're also product of a turn in late medieval thinking about transcendence, not as an escape above time and space, but as a meditative immersion in time and space, transcendence as achieved through attention to creation and to mutability. And I want to try and explain this with reference to various contemporaneous theological and philosophical texts. So this is as much about the history of ideas as about the history of art, I should say. I'm aiming to put these miniatures back in their thought world, as it were, and also to use them to open up the thought world from which they come. Essentially, the aim is to unlock how these miniatures did or provoked a special kind of philosophical work for their audiences that's been overlooked. I want to suggest they were rather ingenious answers to a wider rethinking of transcendence, getting a catastrophic view of the whole as an exercise in, to use a rather modern phrase, being more present, being in the here and now. So I'm dividing what follows into two chunks, and in the first I'm going to explore briefly how the detached catastrophic view was thought about in medieval literature and how medieval thinking on it changed over time, how medieval thinking on it develops over time. And in the second part, I'll come back to the miniatures themselves against the intellectual background I've sketched in the first part. Now, one of the most obvious places to look for the legacy of the kind of Ciceronian view in medieval literature is in the lives of saints, hagiography. Saints' lives are some of the earliest evidence that his view still mattered to Christian writers, that Christian writers were sort of absorbing this view into their thought. And how it appears in these texts is helpful for setting in relief how it's thought about later. So take, that looks like a lot of text, doesn't it? I'll read us through it in a moment. Take Pope Gregory the Great's 6th century life of St. Benedict. St. Benedict, who lived between 480 and 547, was the father of Christian monasticism. And in his biography of Benedict, Pope Gregory, describes him getting a view of the whole world that's essentially gifted to his soul one day by God. And this was depicted in many manuscripts of the life. And here's just one example from a Bavarian manuscript. There's St. Benedict in his tower, and oddly, he's actually looking up at the world here. So he says, and that manuscript's from the 15th century. So Gregory writes, and you can see in the image, how one day the sage retired to the top of a tower. The man of God, Benedict, being diligent in watching, rose early before the time of matins and came to the window of his chamber. Standing there, all of a sudden in the dead of the night, as he looked forth, he saw a light that banished away the darkness of the night. During this vision, a marvellously strange thing followed, for as he himself afterward reported, the whole world gathered together, as it were, under one beam of the sun, was presented before his eyes. Gregory describes then a kind of miraculous vision. He says Benedict was, quote, for a time out of the world, and similar visionary flights occur in other saints' lives, and a particular one would be the life of Saint Columban, the Irish saint, by Jonas de Bobbio, written in the 7th century, where Columban is about to go and convert the Slavs, and an angel comes to him and shows him the whole world shown to him in a small circle. The quote is, in a small circle showed him the structure of the orb of the world. And then the outcome is actually that he realizes the Slavs aren't ready for the Christian faith, and he decides not to go and convert them. But it's a similar kind of rapturous, heaven-sent flight. So far then, so transcendent. In the early medieval period, up to the 12th century, more or less, for a reader looking for the kataskopos, what we find is basically the view from above being credited to extraordinary individuals, saints, and described as a temporary but genuine transportation of the soul by God out of time and space. The individual is wrapped up. And that this was appreciated by medieval readers of these works, later medieval readers, is also suggested by commentaries we have on them. So, for example, the Carolingian scholar Remigius of Auxerre in the 9th century wrote of Benedict that when he saw the world at once, simul totum mundum, he was elevated by a divine spirit beyond the nature of things, ultra omnem rerum naturam sublevatus est. Remigius basically emphasizes, he wants to emphasize, Benedict really did see for a time with more than mortal vision. He really was wrapped up. But there is, increasingly, another way of thinking about transcendence and how one might attain transcendence that runs through the Middle Ages and receives more and more commentary from the 12th century. And that is a way of thinking about the kataskopos, the transcendent view, as an inward meditative discipline. So not so much as ascent of the soul from space, as an expansion of the soul in time. And for the roots of this way of thinking, which I will be explaining, we have to look to another late antique, early medieval work, roughly contemporaneous, in fact, with St. Benedict's life, and that is Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius was a Roman author. It seems he was both a Stoic and a Christian. He was a great translator of Greek and Roman texts, and it's debated how much he was a Christian, but it seems there's a lot of Christian theology in his work, and so for now we'll say yes, he's a sort of mixture of Stoic and Christian, writing in the 6th century in Italy. And his text drew, like Gregory was drawing on the ancients, heavily on people like Cicero, Seneca, all these people who'd done the abstracted view in ancient, in kind of earlier Roman literature. But he does something more philosophical with the cosmic view than Gregory did. In the Consolation, seeing the world from above is specifically about grasping how the world is governed by divine providence. It starts with Boethius, the narrator, in prison. There was an explosion of blog posts about this text during COVID as a perfect lockdown text. For this reason, it's about the flight of the soul sort of from confines. And in both of these illuminations, you can see Boethius looking rather morose at the beginning of the text, although he's actually in rather nice-looking prisons in both of these, as the illuminators have depicted them. But he starts in prison at the beginning of the text, because he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned in real life by Emperor Theodoric. He was a consul. Emperor Theodoric charged him with treason, and he was executed in 524. So the Consolation begins describing his despair at the cruel vicissitudes of fortune. And then this lady appears to him, and she's called Lady Philosophy, and she comes to console him, as the title suggests, that all that happens in the world is actually ordered to the good. And this is where the view from above comes in. The way she consoles him is by, quote, giving his mind wings to see the world from above. And Boethius describes himself lifted in soul, seeing the whole circle of our earth is but a point in comparison with the extent of the whole heaven. That is, if it is compared in size with the celestial sphere, it is judged to have no size at all. And there's an image there from the same manuscript, from that manuscript on the right. That's another image from the same manuscript, which is again 15th century, where that's roughly how Boethius is seeing the world here. That's terra at the centre, the earth at the centre of the 9 spheres. So part of the point Lady Philosophy is trying to make to Boethius here is that everything from that distance, from that high distance, is eternally present to God. The world is being shown not only as a mere point in space, he sees it as a point, punctum, but in a mere point of time, as God sees it. And a popular medieval Latin term for the present was punctum temporis, point of time. The present instant was imagined as a little fleeting point. So there's perhaps a kind of pun when Boethius says he sees the world as a punctum. He's seeing it both as a point in time, as a point in space, a distant point in space, but he's also able to suggest he's seeing it in a kind of present point, as God sees it in his mind. So as Lady Philosophy explains to Boethius, the maker of this great universe, viewing all things from his height, no mass of earth obstructs, no night with black cloud thwarts, what is, what has been, and what is to come, in one swift mental stab he sees. Oh, that was actually a defunct slide. I'm sorry, I should have used this one. In one swift mental stab, he sees what is, what has been, and what is to come. And then she says, just as you see things in this, your temporal present, so he, God, perceives all things in his eternal one. And thus, philosophy says, you shouldn't despair, we shouldn't despair, because what seem like fortune and chance down here are just illusions, tricks of perspective. God, from up there, knows, and by knowing, orders everything before it's even happened in time. In him, our lives are loved and have a coherence and unity that at the beginning of the text, Boethius is obviously in a state of extreme doubt about. The important thing here for us is that the total view in Boethius is implicitly an exercise in kind of imagining this all-encompassing present. It's something we can actually try to simulate inside ourselves, this present that contains all time. And in a minute, I'm going to show how 12th century writers kind of run with this. But first, to bring it home, what's going on here, we can see how Marcus Aurelius had done a very similar thing in his Greek meditations of the 2nd century AD. So he was a Roman, but he wrote in Greek. And he was probably read by Boethius, who could read Greek. He's famous for his repeated iterations of the kataskopos, the need to envisage the cosmic whole of which we're a part. And when Marcus encourages this, here he is, when Marcus encourages this, he always says that we should first draw a circle around the present. And there's Greek for any Greek readers here. So he says, consider how many different things are produced in each one of us in an infinitesimal moment, as much in the bodily as in the psychological domain. And then you will not wonder so much that very many, or rather all the effects of nature, are produced at the same time in this unity and totality which we call the cosmos. So this is a sort of precursor to Boethius's sense of the world from above as the world in an eternal present. The good Stoic, Marcus insists, should try to catch hold of the present, to draw a circle around the present, and then the task is to recognize the intricacy of that circumscribed present moment. How many different things are going on in it, in your body and in your mind? The duty of the good Stoic is to try and fill the moment up in his awareness, as it were, so that the fullness of that present moment becomes a sort of simulacrum of God's eternity, of cosmic wholeness. The tiny, the momentary, dwelt in by the mind, becomes testament to the great and the eternal. This is the same sort of Stoic imaginative logic that Boethius and Marcus share. And it's repeated throughout Stoic writings, but particularly Marcus. And if it seems completely, if it seems confusing, I recommend the only way to really do it is to read Marcus and sort of try and do it for yourself. But there's a sort of imaginative logic he's getting at here, where you can go from the present and you sort of expand out. It's almost like a cinematic dolly zoom, which is a cinematic technique where a camera kind of zooms in while running back on tracks. Hitchcock used it a lot, and it kind of feels like what Marcus is doing. You go into the present moment and you zoom out to the cosmos at the same time. And this is something that Boethius is picking up on, and it's something that also St. Augustine, who had been living in the period between them, he shared this logic too, and he wrote about it. So Augustine had said in his Confessions that eternity, the eternal view of things, is beyond us, but the present moment is a redemptive tool that we can try and use to comprehend eternity, eternal wholeness. And Augustine suggests very movingly in the Confessions how you can notice how your soul becomes distended in the present, stretched out, distended, distentio animi, the distension of the soul, the stretching of the soul is how he describes it. You can notice how your soul does this when you're singing a psalm, because in the psalm you're kind of, your attention is always present as you're singing a psalm. You're holding beginning and end all at once, and that practice is the best way to intuit the wholeness of things and how God holds us in time from outside of time. So again, you can go to the Confessions and try that too. So medieval readers had this notion of the view from above as a temporal exercise, through Boethius especially, and Augustine, as well as the more kind of rapturous transcendent version. That's what I've been trying to get at. And from the 12th century, broadly speaking, it's the former version. It's this kind of imaginative logic of Boethius, of Augustine, of Marcus Aurelius, even though they don't have Marcus Aurelius in the 12th century. It's this kind of imaginative logic that's taken up by authors associated with the monasteries and cathedral schools, which are really flourishing in the 12th century, the age when there's a great flourishing of spiritual literature, and it's just before the universities are coming into being. And some have argued that people teaching in these contexts were actually trying to crack down on the idea that you can get wrapped up to heaven, because they didn't want all these new novices coming in aspiring to get wrapped up to heaven, or claiming that they had become wrapped up to heaven like St. Benedict. But they instead wanted to approach the eternal view as something that can be approached from the here and now through meditation, and specifically meditation on the present. For example, Hugh of St. Victor. Now this is just a map of Paris in the 12th century to sort of orientate us. And in the circle up there is, this is a later map, but this is roughly what Paris might have looked like in around 1200. And in the circle is St. Victor, the school of St. Victor, which was a school for students of Hugh of St. Victor, who was one of the great teachers there, and there he is. And Hugh wrote a series of treatises in the 1120s and 30s that borrowed heavily from Boethius. One of these is called De Vanitate Mundi, on the vanity of the world, in which he describes a cosmic view as a lesson to his novices. And he writes, quote, "Take your stand in spirit then, as it were on a watchtower, and turn your attention on the dwelling place of the world in all directions, so that everything lies spread before your gaze." But Hugh clarifies that this view is really to be taken as an inward discipline. So he puts it succinctly, to ascend to God, ascendere, means therefore to enter into oneself. Intrare. So ascendere, in fact, means to enter into yourself. Worldly vanity and misery results, Hugh says, from our being carried away by the innovatio praesentium, which means the renewal of present moments, which I think is a good description of what it's like to scroll. We're constantly carried away on the renewal of present moments. But by the power of thought, as we saw with Marcus and Augustine, we can catch hold of and extend the present so it becomes a sort of imitation of God's eternal present. So he says, for things have their own kind of being in the mind of man, where even things which in themselves are past can coexist with those yet to come. And in this respect, the soul bears a certain resemblance to its maker, i.e. God. In Hugh's view from above, again, it's realising the power of attention, how the mind can, by an effort of will, hold together past and future. That's the mode of ascent to eternity. And this is how Hugh explains at great length. We kind of get into that tower to see the world spread before us. And with more time, we could see how there are many other authors who are elaborating on this idea of transcendence, not as rapturous flight, but attention and a kind of expansion of the soul in the here and now. And there are authors like Richard of St. Victor and Hildegard of Bingen and Peter of Cell, who all have interesting things to say about this. But instead, my last port of call before I come back to the miniatures is to wind ahead briefly to show how this whole idea of the present part, or the parts of time, as portals to the cosmic whole, was by the mid-13th century a solution that was being proposed by philosophers to the more scientific question of how God relates to his creation and eternity to time. From around 1200, as medievalists in the audience will know, Aristotle's works come back into circulation in Latin. His works had a huge impact on medieval thinking about just about everything. And one of the big things that medieval natural philosophers had to reckon with in Aristotle's works was the idea that whatever eternal being governs the cosmos is a mover, a participant in creation and change. His physics and metaphysics that were read with such enthusiasm by scholastics created an urgency to revisit old questions about how exactly and to what extent God participated in creation and how. So there's just a quote from his physics there, where he says, where Aristotle says there must necessarily be something eternal, whether one or many, that first imparts motion, and this first mover must be unmoved. So very broadly speaking, it was more possible to think of God as a kind of overlooker of creation before Aristotle's coming back into circulation. That's a bit of a vast generalization. But there was an increased urgency when these texts come back in to say, well, how is God in creation? How is he enacting change in creation? And what theologians worried about particularly in embracing this kind of thought was God's unity, because they didn't want to affirm by saying that he was in creation, that he was diffuse, that he was sort of all split up into parts, because it was very important to say that God was unified. So the solution they came up with was to close in on the theory of time and space as made up of atoms, which, as we've already kind of seen, was always there running as a current, an atomic theory of creation. But they really hone in on this idea of creation as made up of atoms, because you could say, if you visualize time and space as made up of atoms, that God was wholly present in each one of those atoms. So an atomic theory was the solution to the dual need to stress God is in creation, but he's also unified. And the great scholar of medieval science, Edward Grant, called this theory the whole in every part theory, the whole in the part, which I've slightly borrowed for my title of this paper. So Richard Fishacre, in the 1240s, who was an English Dominican, he says the way God occupies infinite space is to exist as a whole at each and every place, no more as a whole in the whole space than in the smallest part. It's true, he says, that God is wholly present in every temporal and spatial atom, and this is repeated over the centuries as our miniatures begin to appear in art and literature. So Thomas Aquinas, in the 1260s, I got that wrong there, it's definitely in 1252, he says, the unchanged now of eternity, nunc eternitatis, is present to all the parts of time. And this is being stressed even up to the 15th century with Nicholas of Cusa, who says, eternity as a whole is at once present at every point of time. We've got that phrase again, puncto temporis, point of time. So the takeaway here is that we've gone from the now, a temporal present as an analogy for and a portal to eternal wholeness in meditative contexts, to a very concrete concept of the now of eternity, the nunc eternitatis, as a scientific truth, almost. Eternity is nowhere but now. Eternity is presence. The part is the whole, and the whole is the part. And fascinatingly for us, some of these very writers provide images for this concept, which are for me very evocative of the miniatures themselves. So Fishacre suggests that we can contemplate how the infinite is in the infinitesimal, i.e. the idea of eternal presence, that eternity is here in minute parts, by imagining each atom as a minutely executed painting. He says, the figures and dispositions of an artifact bear witness to the wisdom of the artist. That is, the finer a painting, the wiser the artist must be. But in the smallest atom, there are infinitely many figures, and therefore the wisdom of the divine artist from whom they come is infinite. Again, a bit like Marcus Aurelius, making us use the abundance of the instant to intuit the wholeness of the cosmos, the intricacy of every part of time and space proves the infinity of the maker. Like a finely executed painting makes us wonder at the artist. Minute artistry, then, is Fishacre's image of choice for the mystery of God's participation in creation, eternity in time. And so I know you will be infinitely, eternally relieved that we can come back to the actual things, the miniatures we began with, and this section will be shorter. So in the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes or so, I want to try reading these as experiments in depicting not just the view from above, the God's eye view, which they clearly do, but more specifically as things to be experienced and consoled by. I want to suggest that as their beholders turned them over in their minds and hands, they were meditating on the same riddle of eternal presence, the nunc eternitatis, the now of eternity, that was being thrashed out by philosophers and theologians, and arguably they're thrashing this out more succinctly and more movingly and affectingly. So first off, the Westminster Retable, painted in around 1260 in the circle of Plantagenet court painters, probably for the high altar of Westminster Abbey, and commissioned by Henry III as part of the Abbey's Gothic redesign. Just to orientate us in the iconography, the miniature globe in Christ's hand is both the centerpiece of the painting and it's dwarfed by the surrounding iconography. At the center, Christ is flanked, there we go. At the center, Christ is flanked by the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. And to either side of the central figures are roundels, as you can see in that top image. Most of them are now lost, which show and showed the miracles of Christ. At the far left is Saint Peter with his key to heaven on the left there for you. And then on the other side, it's thought was Saint Paul, which is now damaged. The retable was turned into furniture for some reason, and this is why it's in such a sad state now, although the exquisite quality of its painting is still very, very clear. Now, obviously, I'm not the first person to have talked about this globe. There's a vast literature on the retable as a whole, and there's also writings on the globe. Originally, it was connected by art historians to creation iconography, where the world is shown in its entirety, shaped by God, such as that found in the so-called Crusader Bible of the 1240s, showing the first to fourth days of creation here. And rather neatly, on this folio, in the top left, you can see another iconographic tradition into which scholarship has folded the retable globe, and that's of God holding up an empty orb with a T in it, because they thought the world was divided into the three continents. And here's another example from a Flemish Psalter, where you can see that a bit more clearly. This is Christ holding an empty globe, and it's often referred to as the Majestas Domini image, Christ in majesty. Yet, as art historian Paul Binsky pointed out in a paper on the retable of 1987, quote, no Genesis that is creation scene could include the sort of small curved boat steered with a rudder by a tiny man with a companion that we see in the Westminster orb, and neither is this scene simply a variation on a Christ in majesty. The globe is not held up as a blank token of authority, as it is in the Psalter. It's cradled by Christ as salvator mundi, the saviour of the world. containing an image of both nature and, with the boat, human culture as well. This is a distinctive iconography that has just a few closer relations elsewhere, all dating to within a century of the retable. For example, in this English Apocalypse manuscript, British Library's MS 35166, there's a comparable, though much rougher, kind of filled globe with a little boat. And Christ is again in the guise of Saviour of the world, or Lamb of God, which he touches the little globe with his bare foot there. More strikingly, in the Hours of Jan de Navarre, painted in the 1330s in France, on the page devoted to the office of the Trinity, we have the Father and Son with the Holy Spirit above them, embracing the world, where the world is an even more quotidian little scene of passing life with buildings and a boat, now with a minute sail and a little rabbit and so on. And finally, a little different, I hope you can all make that out. Yeah, a little rabbit there. And then finally, a little different, Simone Martini's drawing for his fresco of the upper tympanum at the Church of Notre-Dame des Doms in Avignon of the 1340s, where again he's cradling a globe which has a little landscape within it, water beneath mountainous shore, dotted with trees, and then a sort of star-spangled firmament in that top slice. So what's going on in this convention? What's being got at? On the one hand, the world is being shown transcendently, holistically, as God or Christ might see it. But as I've already said, these worlds are also radically kind of earthed, they're tactile, scaled down. Christ doesn't look at the world in any of them, he holds it or touches it from a position in the world. Christ of the retable is not transfigured or glorified, he's actually standing barefoot on a brown earth mound, which I wish I could show you. I really tried to find an image that would allow us to see his bare feet, but you'll have to take my word for it. In the Hours of Jan de Navarre, God and Christ are also humanized. They're seated firmly on a three-dimensional stone throne. And the worlds themselves, of course, aren't really God's holistic view. They condescend to our particulate, partial view of the world in time. And I find this really beautiful, that the cosmic or panoptic is hinted at in each case. Each of them is arranged in the same way with water, earth, air, and firmament layered on top of one another, which is exactly how the elements were portrayed in creation scenes, as you can see here in the French Psalter. But in our cases, the elements are blended into or unfold from a quotidian landscape that kind of pricks us with its fleetingness. We go from part to whole. Creation unfolds from a fragment in the hands or lap of God. And that fragment takes the shape of a moment in time. We are, one might argue, on the minute scale of the punctum, or the time atom, the instant. Whether or not, as an audience, you had any theological knowledge or any awareness of all the things we've been looking at, surely what these little abundant worlds led the mind that delighted in them towards was the mystery of God's presence here, a feeling for the infinite value of each instant, when a boat might be sailing by or a bird is pecking at vegetation. I would propose that this handful of painted worlds have something in common with their near cognates of miniaturizing images found in late medieval mystical literature, and ultimately the phenomenon of the prayer nut. So let's come back to Julian of Norwich. Oh yes, there we go. Those two side by side. Let's come back to Julian of Norwich, the anchoress who records a series of visions she experienced, one of which is where she sees the world the size of a hazelnut, which we can now read in full. And in this, she says, he showed me a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand, and to my understanding that it was round as any ball. I looked thereon and thought, what may this be? And I was answered generally thus, it is all that is made. I marvelled how that it might last, for methought it might fall suddenly to naught for little. And I was answered in mine understanding, it lasts and ever shall, for God loves it. Of course, this is famous, and I feel like I've heard this on Radio 4's Thought for the Day, like already 10 times. But let's just dwell on it for a minute, because again, there's literature on this. secondary literature, lots of people have written about this, but like the orbs, there's a very distinctive visionary idea being encapsulated here, which isn't always brought out. And that's how this is markedly a reversal again of the kind of escape from time to see the world Benedict experienced. Julian is seeing all that's made in a nut which is both small and, importantly, transitory, negligible, something you would tread underfoot, that seems, she says, it might fall to naught for little. That's what touches her about it. It might just sort of evaporate or pass out of being. But when you look at more closely, a hazelnut is miraculously intricate, round as a ball, loved. What this catastrophic vision does, without trying to kind of kill it with interpretation, which is of course the risk, is again to stage transcendence as an experience of immanence. It does both the Boethian thing of showing us the world as God would see it in an eternal present, but downscaled to the nut, this vision also makes eternity present. It makes it now. And Julian talks frequently about God being present as the midpoint in her life, using that term point again, as though he's there in the present atom, in a way that I think what's going on here can be seen as connected, kind of reliving the same kind of logic that's potentially being got at in those painted orbs. And now finally, the prayer nuts. These objects have a very rich literature of their own again, and I'm not claiming to be an expert on prayer nuts. There are many wonderful experts on prayer nuts. But I want to finish them with them because whatever else can be said of them, I think they're surely the proper descendants of what we've been tracing, the ultimate kind of technological realization of the ideas we've been tracing. The prayer nut, as a sculptural phenomenon, takes off in the 15th century in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries. And experts think that all of them, about 150 survive today, come from a close-knit network of workshops, perhaps even a single workshop. The only name we have to connect them with is Adam Dierks, who likely headed a large team of carvers. And they were meant and used, as I said, as devices for personal meditation by the medieval citizen, lay people and clerics. They were carried in a case or hung on a belt or on rosaries or paternosters. Take, for example, this one in the Rijksmuseum. It's only 4.8 millimeters, 480 millimeters, 4.8 centimeters in diameter. And this one has a rare silver case. And inside are exquisitely carved scenes which recognizably contain the adoration of the Magi on the left here, Mary with her baby and the Magi, and on this side, the Nativity, again, in the bottom corner, in the bottom part. As mentioned above, Fritz Scholten has recently explored the experience of handling and viewing prayer nuts as one of catastrophe, looking down from a great height, he says. While at the same time, he says, these pull the beholder close into a meditative absorption in which the sense of real time is lost. Indeed, they demand long, laboured looking to make sense of. In fact, you wouldn't be wrong to find the carving very confusing. The aim of carvers, it seems, was to create a kind of Where's Wally experience that you could get lost in. The eternal blurs with the temporal. The scenes in prayer nuts always centre around acts of divine intervention in time, and they always focus particularly then on the events of the incarnation, God made man. And then these scenes around the incarnation are presented as scenes that are happening in the present, in the 15th century. They are what look like 15th century merchants kind of chatting over this wall, nonchalantly, right next to merchants chatting over the wall. It's just one example, kind of next to Christ lying in a halo of light on the ground. So the task is to find the seismic divine event playfully hidden in the mundane. While doing this, while reading the minute scenes, is itself, as Scholten said in that quote, an experience of time suspended, time slowed down, and the present expanding. So with these participation of the eternal in time is both depicted and it's felt by us as we get lost in the abundance of these little worlds. And there's so much more that could be said about these, which just continue to captivate. But how their miniaturization seems intended again as an invitation to ponder the coincidence of the finite and the infinite, time and eternity, seems to me one of their great achievements. So to conclude, I'm going to add something slightly experimental. When I described earlier how the Westminster orb seems to convey the mystery of God's presence, I drew attention to the inclusion of incidental details. I said this world seems to be saying God is kind of there, hidden in and sustaining each mundane moment, even when a boat is sailing by or a bird is pecking at vegetation. In doing so, I came very near to quoting a famous poem by W.H. Auden. The first stanza of his poem Musée des Beaux-Arts of 1938 goes like this. About suffering they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course, anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot, where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the tortuous horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. So, as I said, this has been an experiment. Replace sort of suffering and miraculous birth and these events, these seismic events he's describing with sort of God's presence, with God's love. And Auden almost might have been describing the Westminster orb, except of course he wasn't. He was describing the fall of Icarus by Breughel, Breughel the Elder, Pieter Breughel the Elder, painted in 1555. The main tragic event, the fall of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun into the sea, is just a detail in the bottom right corner, just under the boat. You can see his legs disappearing into the sea. Auden, in his great ekphrasis, expresses how Breughel is able to, in paint, to show us that it's always within the humdrum, the everyday, the moment, that great and terrible, eternal things are happening. And Breughel does this not just here in this rather apt choice for this talk about the fall of Icarus, the fall of the boy who wanted a transcendent view. He does it throughout his paintings. His compositions are always teetering on the cosmic while utterly invested in moments and accidents. The weird fisheye encyclopedic look of the Icarus painting, combined with its consummate attention to detail, that kind of mid-tread of the ploughman in the foreground, makes it for me almost a kind of paratext for the Westminster orb, with its little oblivious boatman to the presence of Christ holding it. Or indeed the little merchants chatting next to the nativity scene in the prayer nuts that were made obviously not long before Bruegel's painting in his native Netherlands. So where to go with what I've talked about here? What happens after miniaturizing prayer nuts in European art and thought? I don't have a clear answer or a simple answer to that. There isn't a simple answer for sort of where to go with this. But I do think that there is, in the way that Bruegel painted, an undeniable echo and development of the way that the prayer nuts and the painted worlds were blending the cosmic with the temporal, the present, and presenting the whole, as it were, through the part. So I leave that as a thread that I hope to pick up in future in furthering this work. As a final reflection, I'll just say that rediscovering how writers and artists have troubled over the contradictory scales of human thought long before us seems to me particularly timely in this global moment where we're trying to plough our own furrows, as it were. We're trying to live locally, but also think on an unprecedentedly large scale about the news and about the environment. So I leave you with Thomas Nagel, who's a contemporary philosopher, whose solution to that dilemma in his book, The View from Nowhere, seems to circle right back to the way medieval people were thinking about how to combine perspectives. So he writes, to combine the recognition of our contingency, our finitude, and our containment. Sorry, it is necessary, Nagel writes, to combine the recognition of our contingency, our finitude, and our containment in the world with an ambition of transcendence. the view sub specie eternitatis is a very poor view of human life, and we should start and end in the middle of things. So to end in the middle of some thoughts that I'd very much welcome your perspective on, thank you very much for listening to this, and I look forward to any questions and comments. Thank you.